I'm Michael Goldman. Welcome to another podcast from the front lines, where each month we talk with filmmakers from various disciplines about their work on current major feature films. This month, our guests are Billy Goldenberg, ACE, and Harry Yoon, editors of Kathryn Bigelow's new historical drama, Detroit. The movie dramatizes a tragic real life event, the so called Algiers Motel police brutality incident that took place within the larger context of the Detroit riots during the summer of 1967. The topical film addresses real events and people, a particular time and place, and the impact of violence on both the perpetrator and the victim, among other things. As such, cutting it together was quite complex, as the filmmakers had to cull through reams of original footage shot by Bigelow's team, stitch it together with archival footage, and transfer it into a highly emotional dramatic tale that satisfied the needs of cinematic viewership while simultaneously addressing complex pacing challenges. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks, guys, for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. We're excited to
Our
be here.
pleasure.
I thought to start, maybe you both could give a quick explanation about how you got together for this project. You know, why Kathryn wanted or needed two editors, Kathryn Bigelow, the director, why she needed two editors, why it made sense to collaborate. I know, Bill, obviously you've worked with Kathryn before on Zero Dark 30, how it all came together that you became the editing team for this movie, Detroit.
Harry was the visual effects editor on Zero Dark 30, and since that time, he'd done a great deal of cutting and on his own. And what drew my attention to his editing was his work on the Newsroom, the Aaron Sorkin show. And when it came time to do Detroit, it was clear that I couldn't start the film full time because I was still on Ben Affleck's Live by Night. And there was going to be about 2 months where I was still going to be on that film. But Ben was nice enough to share me with Kathryn as we were finishing post-production. So I explained it to Kathryn. She was on board with it, and she said, "Look, take a young editor to help you while you're overlapped, and whoever you decide is the right person. It's fine with me." So I thought Harry was doing great work on the Newsroom. He knew Kathryn. And I think Kathryn really liked him and trusted him. And quite frankly, I thought Harry was a really good person, and I think that's a really important thing when you're working in close quarters in an editing room. So not only did I think he was talented, but I thought he was a really good person. And I ran the idea past Kathryn and the producer Colin Wilson, and they thought it was a great idea. And Harry did some beautiful work on the movie, and I don't obviously couldn't have been, I couldn't have done it without him.
Yeah, and for me, Michael, it was like a dream come true to be able to work with an editor whom I really respected and who I saw very directly the kind of work that he was doing to shape the film on Zero Dark 30. And it's funny because Billy and I kept running into each other. He's an alumnus of Temple University, and they invite people in post production every so often to come speak about their careers. And so we kept running into each other at those meetings. So it was really great to sort of like keep in touch with him and to hear about what he was up to, and for me to get a chance to share what I was up to. And so it was a real honor when I got the call from him, just because he was somebody that I really hoped to work with again. And to do it in this fashion was really, I couldn't have asked for a better opportunity.
Bill, I think you had experience, working with one or more other editors on major feature films, like three, four times, maybe more than that. Both you guys, what's your philosophy? I mean, obviously, the reason that you took on two editors was scheduling was one of the issues, as you explained to me. But what was your both philosophy about how you get two guys together who maybe have worked different ways on different kinds of projects and kind of split up the work, and how you're going to break it all down once you got together?
Well, I mean, not only was it a scheduling thing, but Kathryn shoots a tremendous amount of footage, and it's very difficult footage. So, I mean, I think the idea of two editors was born out of the schedule, but it was. Well, I mean, I'd say it was definitely a necessity in terms of handling that amount of film and keeping the film on schedule and being able to show Kathryn a first cut very soon after she was done shooting. I think if I had done it by myself, it would have taken a lot longer. And so it was, like I said, born out of the schedule. But really, it was quite fortunate that it worked out that way. Most of the films I've done where there's two editors or more editors, you divide up the film mostly by who's ready to cut the next scene. There are some times where one editor will say, "Gee, I'd really like to cut that sequence. Can I cut that sequence?" Everybody generally says, "Sure," because if you have that much passion for it. you should go ahead and do it. So there were a few sequences on this film that I said to Harry, I got this one, because I was just really excited about doing it. For instance, the scene at the Fox Theater when the dramatics are about to go on, and the riots are too overwhelming, so that they stop the show and send everybody home. That was one that I really was charged up about. So, I told Harry that please let me take that one. And then generally what happens, you end up sticking with those sequences throughout the cut, because you know the footage better than anybody, and you generally follow those sequences through to the end. And then sometimes there are scenes swapped around from editor to editor, because of, they fall in a sequence that it makes sense to give that one section over to the other editor to have a continuous flow of a big stretch of the film. And that's pretty much been the way it's worked on almost all the films I've done, multiple editor shows, except for the Michael Bay films, which is kind of like a bit of a free-for-all in a good sense, in that everybody works on everything all the time. I mean, sometimes two people on the same scene at the same time. So, and it becomes this real sort of collegial sort of everybody helps everybody, everybody's doing everything, and it's a lot of fun. But I think most of the experiences I've had, it's been, you divide up the scene by necessity, by who's ready to cut the next scene, and then, you hang with it. And it's a great way to work, because when you have another editor who you trust, you're able to cut a sequence, and then, I can run into Harry's room and say, hey, take a look at this. What do you think? And he'll see things that I haven't seen, or give me notes that I wouldn't have thought of. And hopefully the same, it goes, the other way around. So it's great to have a second set of eyes on a scene or a sequence before you show it to the director, because I think it just gets that much further along. So, and I've been fortunate to work with editors, some really phenomenally talented people over the years, and it's always made the movies better.
It's that part of the process that was like the most nerve-wracking and my favorite part of the day, which was at the end, when we sort of put together our first cuts, we'd show them to each other. And what was great was, first off, sort of picking up where stylistically and rhythm-wise, what Billy was focused on and how he was dissecting the footage, and seeing what shots were really working for him based on the stylistics of how Barry and Kathryn were shooting the movie. And then sort of picking up on those cues and really sort of seeing how that was developing. And we were showing each other scenes every day. And so there wasn't this kind of cloistered environment in which we were sort of like off working on our own scenes. It was very much a checking in with each other on a daily basis. And so I think that allowed for a kind of coherence from beat to beat, especially once we started putting together scenes that were either at the same time or very close sequentially with each other. For example, once we got into the motel, it was really helpful to have those daily sessions in which we're checking in with each other and looking at each other's cuts.
Now, getting into the movie itself, you've referenced a couple of events within it. This is, of course, a real event, something that happened during the riots in Detroit in 1967, the so-called Algiers Motel incident, in which police officers basically committed abusive acts against young African Americans and people they were hanging out with. Bill, I know in your case, anyway, you've done several movies that have at least been based on or inspired by real events, Seabiscuit, Argo, Zero Dark 30, The Imitation Game, Unbroken. Maybe there's others. I don't know if you have, Harry. Well, there you go. So, I mean, is that intentional? Is there an attraction to that for either or both of you? Or was it just that's what the filmmakers who you have relationships with are into, and so what the heck, that's what we're going to be cutting?
Well, it is intentional. I like to mix up the genres that I do, but I find myself, I have a lot of fun working on big, action things like, Transformers or National Treasure or things like that. But I am attracted to reality-based films, and I seem to be attracted to directors who are making them. So, Ben and Kathryn specifically, and then Morton Tilden on The Imitation Game, and Gary with Seabiscuit. So I am attracted to that kind of subject. I find that it's really exciting to bring a sort of smaller, or a true story to light. And, a small story like The Imitation Game set against a huge backdrop. This is obviously an unknown story that's such a big story that no one knew about. And the idea of being able to tell that story and let the world see what happened is really attractive to me, and it also brings with it a tremendous sense of responsibility, and the stakes, I feel, for me are much higher because you really want to try and get it right. So it makes it very, exciting and very challenging, which is, which is probably why I head in that direction, because I like to do things to challenge myself.
And as we were talking about the Algiers Motel incident, I mean, obviously it was Kathryn Bigelow and her collaborator, the writer Mark Bowl, were in charge of researching and figuring out the story to tell, overview, big picture kind of thing. But maybe you could both address the role that you played as editors in terms of helping them find the specific nature, the beats of this story. After all, in this particular case, if from what I've read, not every single aspect of what actually went down in the real Algiers Motel has been documented 100%, and you also have responsibility to make sure you're hitting your beats to get the audience, interested and entertained and emotionally attached to it. You have a time limitation to tell a very wide story, all those kinds of issues. So at what point and in what ways did the two of you jump in to say, well, here's how we could accomplish that. Here's where we want to hew to reality. Here's where we want to compact things, but get the essence of it, all those sorts of challenges.
One of the most interesting aspects of that was trying to figure out not just the details of the motel incident itself, but what was necessary in terms of context for an audience, especially one that wasn't as familiar with the 1967 Detroit riots, or in particular the horrors that happened in that motel. So what context, sort of historically, sociologically, and even sort of within the context of the riot itself, to set them up to understand how could something like this have happened? What was the environment in which it happened? And I think that's where a lot of our discussions focused on. The actual beat-by-beat events within the motel, while there were some decisions made ultimately to omit the visualization of some violence, beat by beat, that stayed really consistent. I think where most of our shaping was in the first act and then in the third act afterwards, to determine sort of what context do you need to sort of understand the environment, and then afterwards, what helps people understand and in some ways kind of contextualize and hopefully recover a little bit from the violence and the terror that we've been through. And so a lot of our calibration focused on those areas.
Speaking, of sort of the first act, as you mentioned, Harry, one of the things that fascinated me when I saw this movie, and Bill, you and I have talked in the past about, sort of how do you cut a tension-filled dramatic scene that doesn't have a ton of dialogue, or interpersonal character stuff going on, but you guys and Kathryn set the stage by taking us, the viewer, literally into the Detroit riots, painting that picture before we arrive at the Algiers Motel, where everything eventually goes down. But I was particularly impressed by the way that opening part of the movie was cut and presented, because it showed the humanity, kind of buzzing around a riot. Enraged people ticked off, law enforcement pressured and reacting in all sorts of different ways, and then a lot of people trying not to get caught in it and trying to continue with their lives, get to work, party, have a little fun, let off some steam, that kind of stuff. So I thought maybe you could both address the challenges and solutions of cutting together that opening part of the movie there.
Well, I mean, it was incredibly challenging because, like Harry said, we were trying to set the context to understand the exhaustion, the paranoia, the violence, the outrage, all the different things that led us to the Algiers, and how it sort of how it happened, how that the paranoia about snipers, and the frustration of the African American community, and the obtuse points of view of the police, and not understand, and thinking they're doing the right thing when they're doing such horrible things, and having all that be understood. So when you arrive there, that all the events that happen in that motel, you sort of understand how we got here. So it doesn't feel like this. So there is a depth to it, and there is an understanding about who these people are, who the people in the motel are, and why they're committing these crimes, and how people are reacting, so that it just isn't come in a vacuum, and everything from the Jacob Lawrence paintings in the opening, all through the beginning of the horrible night is there to give you context for that night. And we're not trying. I mean, there could be, a 10-hour miniseries or on just the riots themselves, and we weren't trying to tell the entire story of why the riots started. It's so complicated, and you could, like I said, there have been books and books and books written on it. So we're just trying to give the audience enough backdrop and enough information so you understand how everybody got there.
Even in the material itself, there was so much that Kathryn was giving us. Each one of those beats, like, for example, Fred Temple heading into work, trying to cross that line between protesters and the police, like, there was much more material there. There was so much material of the army getting set and, establishing a base of operations at a local high school, and then, rolling out from there and, establishing a presence within the city, more of the looters, more of the fires, more of each one of those beats. And there's actually more material that was establishing the Algiers Motel during the middle of it as well. And the real challenge was, it was such compelling material that she and Barry were giving us, on a daily basis, like just beautiful shots and like really sort of everything felt kind of urgent and necessary. And I think the challenge was getting that all together and then going through that process of winnowing it down to the essence, I guess, the most muscular version of that context, so that, we got the mood that we needed, the information that we needed, but didn't sort of slow us down in setting up context before we got to, when everybody arrived at that motel together. So that was the big challenge, was trying to sort of winnow things down and make it as spare but as necessary as possible.
Mark Ball, as a screenwriter, did a really interesting, which I think is a unique kind of thing, which is, instead of just, you could have just started this movie, Fred wakes up in the morning, Larry wakes up, and everybody goes about their day, and you have, they all sort of meet, and that would be sort of the typical way to tell a story like this. But, the way he wrote the script was that it hands off from, it starts and you meet the people that are in the Blind Pig, and they're having this party, celebrating the return of this Vietnam vet. And you meet this guy, Leon, who then is gunned down in the street by Krause, who is then leads you to the next character and the next character. And it's a series of handoffs, and which finally leads you to Larry and Fred, and Krause and the two other policemen, and they all end up in the same place together. And I think it's a really unique and interesting way of telling a story, where you're getting all the social context and emotional context without doing it in a very non-traditional way. So you're telling the story of how the riots sort of started and spread, but at the same time handing off from character to character until you finally arrive at the Algiers. And I think it gives the story, it makes the audience sort of lean into the story in a way that maybe you wouldn't have, where you're sort of waiting for this event to happen, where you're challenging the audience to follow along in a way that I think is really an interesting storytelling device.
And then we roll into, the meat of the movie, what goes down inside the Algiers Motel. And, much of the movie, that whole confrontation between the police who invade the place and the people who are there takes place pretty much in a hallway and a couple rooms of the Algiers Motel. A lot of it with them up against the wall. The young African-American men and two young ladies who are with them. They're essentially abused and tormented and all that kind of stuff. It seems like the approach to me was to sort of paint the pressure and the tension and the fear and the anger and the points of view, but not to sidetrack us into, just strictly being repulsed by the physical brutality, which might make it hard for us to understand anything else. There was kind of a fine line there. In other words, I'm thinking that you guys had to walk. So, similarly, I thought maybe you could talk us through cutting that big chunk of the movie, that essence of the movie.
We are in that motel for about an hour of the film from the beginning, when Larry and Fred arrive, into when Fred is killed. So, but it's interesting. Like Harry was talking about earlier, they were shooting it in pieces, as you will. So we were cutting it in pieces, but they would do a section of the annex, and then they would start the next day to do the next section. And they shot it roughly in sequential order. when they would go back the next day to pick up the next sequence, they would always go back and overlap a couple of minutes to get the continuity of emotions correct. So we would cut the sequences, and the next day we would get another few hours of incredible footage that would pertain to what we had just cut. So we were constantly going back and recutting and recutting and recutting, and they were also tweaking things as they went. They would tweak because it was so complicated where people were and what time and when different things happened. I think there were times where they were like, "Hold on, this has to be this way and not that way," and they would change, slightly change the blocking or slightly change, the geography of things so that it would ultimately make sense. It was an incredibly difficult thing on the set for them to keep track of. But then we had all these individual pieces, and everybody being brought down the stairs, and everybody being in their rooms, and everybody doing it, and they were all simultaneous. At one point, when it was all cut, Harry and I sat together and put it together, trying to figure out how to make sense of all of it, make it clear where everybody was, and keeping all these simultaneous stories happening.
Yeah, as Billy was saying, like there's a physical reality, there's a physical continuity, and a reality that we needed to build as things were happening. Because as Billy mentioned, that there were subtle little changes happening on the overlaps each time. So from the hallway to a bedroom, or bedroom back to a hallway. And then we'd also have like additional material of people reacting to things that they were hearing in a bedroom. For example, like, them reacting to Anthony Mackie's character getting punched, for example. We'd get that across a number of days. So there was a physical reality where we needed to sort of establish where people were at each time. But then there was also an emotional reality, which I think evolved over time. One notable instance, for example, was we quickly realized how essential it was to, even though they couldn't say any words to each other, to maintain that bond and that link, the looks that Fred and Larry were giving to each other, because they're going through this like horrific experience, and they need to sort of check in with each other and sort of get a bead on what one another was feeling, especially Larry, who in some ways feels responsible for Fred being there. And just then starting to refine that kind of emotional reality of character relationships, the reality of John Boyega's character, Dismukes, as he stumbles upon this scene, and through looks and through just checking in with him emotionally, like what he's experiencing, what he's thinking, what he's coming to understand about the horror of the situation. That was a whole second layer that we needed to build after we had built each sort of room to room sequence. And so that was a really interesting challenge, coming together and, finding those shots and, combing through, the volumes of footage that we had to find that right look for that check-in that we were looking for emotionally, to maintain a kind of emotional continuity. And, I think it's so essential that we had such a great staff of assistant editors who knew the footage backwards and forwards, who would do these beautiful sort of sequences for us where they were logging footage for us beat by beat, and then updating those logs as we would get more overlapping footage. And so we really relied upon them to be partners with us in finding and culling those beats that would lay on top of that physical reality to help us shape the emotional story of what was happening for each one of the characters.
By the way, where was editorial based, and how many assistants did you have? I mean, two different editors, you might have different ways you like your bins organized, stuff like that.
Well, we were since I was doing Live by Night at Lantana, a place called Lantana in West LA. They were nice enough to have the cutting rooms for Detroit in the same building, so I was able to run up and down the hall every day for the first couple of months, which made my life a lot easier. And we had our first assistant was Justin Yates during the shooting, and then after shooting, Justin became the visual effects editor, and Brett Reed, who's been my first assistant for really almost 20 years, and he came in and took over as first assistant, and then we had Peter Dudgeon as our second assistant, and June Kim, was our phenomenal apprentice, and Alex Grossi was our production assistant, and it was really all hands on deck team effort. It was so much footage, and it wasn't a very big crew for that much footage, and it was a fairly short shoot to have that volume of film. And like Harry was saying, I mean, the organization of it, the assistants were able to do was so helpful to us and made our jobs so much easier, but it also allowed us to, like Harry said, a layer in this emotional depth, because we were able to access this footage and access the beats. They would break the sequences down by line and by emotional beat in a way that it was much easier to go through and find the moments that Harry was talking about. It expedited the whole editing process in a way that was immeasurable. It was so helpful. We would have taken an extra few weeks actually to put the movie into first cut if it wasn't for the phenomenal job they did.
The other thing that fascinated me about the movie, Kathryn Bigelow, chose to have her cinematographer Barry Ackroyd basically constantly move the camera, as near as I could tell, giving it somewhat of a documentary feel. And I've read Kathryn talking about, since Zero Dark 30 and this movie of filmmaking, kind of journalistic style filmmaking, I guess she called it. Did she talk to you guys about that philosophy or concept and what that meant and how to keep that going, as far as the editing is concerned? Because I would think a constantly moving camera, there are scenes where it's hard to see clearly a particular thing happening, but that's being done on purpose for a creative reason, because if you were in chaos you wouldn't see clearly, etc. So did she come to you and explain, here's the philosophy and the approach and what I need you to do in editing to further enhance that?
Yeah, I mean, I would think mostly not. I mean, I think the great thing about Kathryn, and the thing that makes it so much fun to be her editor, or editors in this case, is that once she trusts you, she gives you this tremendous creative freedom. We would put the sequences together, and she was liking what she was seeing, and she would talk a little bit about, that Barry, they wouldn't do quite often they wouldn't do camera rehearsals, so that there would be this alive feeling, that it would be this camera that was always searching and finding moments. And fortunately for us, Barry and his crew, because Barry operates the A camera, and his other operators are such great storytellers that they're not just pointing the camera. They're pointing the camera in an effort to tell the story. And they have a deep understanding of what the emotional story is, what this narrative, the text, the basic text of the script is. So they're always looking for those storytelling moments, and they're phenomenal at it. So, and as editors, you're looking for those same moments, and the challenge is to how to put them together in a cohesive way that tells us a really visceral and exciting, tension-filled story. So it wasn't really conversations; it was more, reactions to the sequences, and she really liked the way things were going together. So during the shooting, there wasn't a whole lot of, and she's so busy anyway, trying to shoot this huge film in such a short amount of time. So she was liking what she was seeing, and so there really wasn't a whole lot of conversation about it. And Kathryn has a magical way of, even when you're during the director's cut, or even after, as you're doing the producer's changes or more changes after that, she has a magical way of communicating volumes with a few sentences. So she would come in and just give us a few basic notes, but to me anyway, I kind of just understood what she wanted and understood what she meant. And but like I said, she gives you incredible creative freedom, and you really feel like a true collaborator when you're working with her.
And one of the privileges of seeing great camera work is to recognize the editing that's happening within the camera sometimes too. Just saw the film again recently, and just remember a shot that Billy chose for one of the courtroom sequences, where the shot goes from something a prosecutor says in profile, racks to a reaction shot that a juror has, and then pulls out wide to pick up the rebuttal from the defense attorney. Like there's ways that there's cutting happening with the motion and the focus of the focal plane of the camera that Barry and his team were able to accomplish. And Billy and I naturally gravitated toward those things because there's such dynamism within the frame, yet still, as he said, at the service of storytelling, that it was really wonderful to be able to work with material like that, so that we didn't have to cut in those instances. And I think we naturally started to be drawn to that in terms of that. And the other thing I'd mention is that as the takes proceeded, even though there was a kind of free-form documentary energy to the way the camera was moving, I think as we moved toward later takes, you started to see how the blocking and the camera movement started to achieve a kind of dance, a kind of choreography, and that they were finding they were settling into the shots that ultimately made sense for Kathryn. I think it was a fascinating process watching the difference between take 1 and take 3 and take 5, because you started to see the scene come together in this fascinating way of the camera people sort of honing in on the performance, honing in on the blocking, and then I'm sure sort of beyond the frame, Kathryn sort of, saying a word here or two to focus them on a particular beat within a performance. And so it's like wonderful to see that progression, and then helped us to hone in on the things that on set, even though no direct notes were given, you could sort of see that progression happening within the performance of the camera, and allowing us to sort of understand what was important about the scene.
And speaking of, the word performance, obviously there's a great cast in this movie, and they did a phenomenal job. But you alluded earlier, you guys, to, the issue of brutality, and there was a decision that, you didn't want to cross a line that might take people out of a story just because you could show it really well or something like that. It seemed to me as the viewer that a strategic utilization of your actors, faces, fingers, body parts quivering, sweat, blood, physical movements, kind of compensated for when you could not show, a direct act of violence up close in all its glory, so to speak, that they were portraying the brutality of it for you. Was picking and choosing all of that material and weaving it together a hard job, since from what you're saying, it sounds like they gave you a whole ton of it?
Yes, it was. We had it all. We could have been as graphic as we wanted, but we chose instead, in almost every instance, because this film is an effort to humanize victims of violent crime. I mean, by showing somebody get shot in the chest, that's just, like you say, going to pull the audience out of it. And what this film is about is the toll it takes on the people involved and the people who have to either go on with their lives or bear witness to horrible acts and what it does to them psychologically and physically. So, and it just made more sense to us to use those pieces of film to show what was happening to the people, to the individuals that were affected by this, and not show people getting shots, at close range. It just feels that was going to push an audience away, and it was going to be too graphic, and so it just made sense, and it was dramatically more interesting, emotionally more interesting to do it that way. Because, like we said, we had the opportunity to do anything we wanted. And part of it is you're leading to the emotional breakdown of these characters. I mean, what happens to Fred, where he's pushed to the edge to the point where he knows he can get away. He can't bring himself to say, "I don't see anything." He can't bring himself to lie. He has to tell the truth in the face of being gunned down by this policeman. And so it was much more interesting to show his emotional breakdown and how he gets to that place than to show the actual things that they're causing him, so it was, to break down like that. So we chose in almost every case to stay with the people that were being affected by these different crimes. It just felt like a more tasteful and respectful thing to do as well. It just felt like I don't want to see as an audience in this film a young 18-year-old kid get gunned down by a shotgun. I just would, that's going to push the audience away instead of drawing them in.
The other thing, speaking of what you can see, is there's archival footage in the movie. There's a ton of news footage and whatnot from the Detroit riots, not necessarily in the Algiers Motel at the time, but from the riots and some of the events that you're depicting and that are surrounding. What was the philosophy, the approach about how to use archival footage? It wasn't only seen, just on a TV screen, and there was at least two instances, maybe, or three, where I really couldn't tell if it was archival or if Kathryn shot it. So maybe you could sort of address how that was woven together so seamlessly.
The first time it really sort of was breathtaking was when Billy was putting together the sequence where the army rolls out across the freeways to their deployment, and like you said, like even, at avid resolution, we could start to see that it was hard to distinguish between, and I think part of this has to do with the genius of the camera setup that Barry and Kathryn chose, which was to shoot on Alexa Minis with like older, I think Super 16 and Super 16 millimeter lenses. I could be getting the technology wrong, but I think the idea being that to have a similar grain and depth that you might see in something from the late 60s, early 70s. And I think that's part of what allowed that kind of seamless interplay between those things. And I think there was after a while, I think what I saw evolving in how we were integrating stock footage was not to sort of have like this set piece where it's just stock in one instance, and then the bits of our writing was just to sort of like show relationally that to see sort of common elements within the frame that helped go from one shot to another. So, for example, Molotov cocktail breaking to near a storefront to stock footage of a storefront, which is one of the things Billy put together. Like once we start to see that kind of editing logic evolve as we were trying to integrate the footage, it became, something that we looked for in the pieces of stock that we selected and how we tried to integrate it so that it felt of a piece, because some of the shots that we were finding were so powerful.
You mentioned some of the technology they used to set it up and shoot it in a way that would be reminiscent of that footage or match with that footage and that kind of thing. Were you guys needing to be very involved in sort of setting a template for the digital intermedia in terms of some of the grain and the lighting and things that kind of evoked, at least for people, unfortunately, of my age, who saw footage on TV back in those days a little bit as a youth, that would sort of evoke it. I know they took it to Company 3 and with the colorist Stefan Nakamura, who's very, very talented. But did you guys have to lay down any template or offer suggestions? Did you participate in the DI, any of that stuff?
I did. I mean, and it was, but I didn't have to do very much. Barry, the way he shot it, so blended with the archival footage, and basically Barry and Kathryn, and then I helped a little, but Stefan and Barry did such a good job when they first passed through that we had very minor changes, and it wasn't a really long digital intermedia process. The film was more contrast. It was made a little darker, a little murkier, a little contrastier. But the first looks we had, the dailies were so good that we didn't really have to do much to it. It was a fairly painless digital media, and there was the idea of putting a grain pass on the footage we shot, but they didn't even have to do very much of that. So it was either by real credit to Barry and Kathryn's planning and the way they set up the cameras. It really was a very painless process.
And we got to wrap up. Sort of a more global question to wrap up. This particular movie, like a lot of Kathryn's work, is going to have some political implications. Going to get talked about. Is being talked about in relationship to current events as well as in relationship to remembering what happened back in the day. And I think I saw Kathryn interviewed and where she felt that was a good thing in the long run. You guys, in your capacity as editors, specifically, when you're cutting the movie, do you have to be cognizant or concerned with those implications and let's send the folks a message and all that, or do you try to compartmentalize and be like, no, we just have to do whatever serves the story, the social aspect will emerge or won't emerge? Do you have an obligation to both things, or you just there to help Kathryn tell her story and you try to rein in those instincts?
I think the answer is yes. Well, because they're all true. They're all true. I mean, to varying degrees. I don't know how Harry feels, but I don't feel like it's our job to say, okay, we're going to teach somebody a lesson. I think our job is to service the story of the movie and, like you say, to help Kathryn make the best film possible. But at the same time, you have to, I mean, you're a human being. It does come into your mind what the political and social implications are going to be, but you just try and be smart and try and do what the appropriate thing is and try and tell it, but you want to tell the best real story you can, and almost and without political judgment, because it's up to you. Want the viewer to decide for themselves. I don't, in 0 Dark 30, in this movie, in Argo, and all the film based on a true story things and movies that I've done, I try and remain objective, and see both sides, see all sides of everything, and to let the audience decide. And I don't think as a filmmaker you want to start preaching to people. You want to tell a really good story, an honest, truthful story, and let the viewers form their own conclusions.
Yeah, I think the way that it impacted our discussions was we understood how important and how serious it was to try to get it right, to try to not fall over into a polemic, but to try to present things in a way where people weren't distracted by too strident, a message one way or the other. I think in trying to sort of be careful about calibrating, like, what is the context in which this happened? How can we, communicate the horror of what's happening without it being exploitative? And then, how do we sort of find a way to contextualize it afterwards, without being sentimental or without getting into platitudes? Like, a lot of the discussions I think we had internally and with amongst ourselves was motivated by an understanding of how politically resonant that this film could be. I mean, while we were cutting it last year, it was just hard to watch the dailies and not think about, the videos that we were seeing in the news and things like that. So I think what that did was it informed us to take things seriously, to take our job seriously, and to understand that there was a responsibility involved. And that was tremendously motivating.
Well, I think it's an important film and a well done film, and we want to thank both you guys for taking the time to talk about Detroit. So thanks to Bill Goldenberg and Harry Yoon for joining us and talking about this very important film.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
And that was another Studio Daily podcast from the front lines. My conversation with editors Billy Goldenberg, ACE, and Harry Yoon about their work on Kathryn Bigelow's new film, Detroit. We hope you enjoyed it. Watch your inbox every month for more newsletters directing you to our monthly podcasts covering the art, science, and people involved in the world of feature filmmaking. I'm Michael Goldman. Have a great day.